Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Frozen, the musical. When the movie came out in 2013, it would be the most celebrated animated film ever. It would generate $1.28 billion. Keep in mind, at that time, it was so remarkable because a third of the money came from the United States. 2/3 of the money then came from literally around the world. So it clearly reminds us that Disney is the king of entertainment literally everywhere in the world. Oksana, I wonder if you could turn down the house lights for us, please. Thank you. Okay, too much light here for me. That's it. That's the way I like to see. Oh, that's perfect. Okay, so, all of this goes back to the idea that Disney clearly understood an ancient idea about storytelling. It had to include magic. It had to include local references. It had to be contemporary. And so Disney, through all of these years, he started in the 1920s doing animation and would literally define animation and turn it into an art form. Of course, Walt Disney would win more Oscars than anyone in the world. So the end result is he conquered not only the movie industry, but he conquered television with the Disney Channel. He conquered, cruise ships with, of course, the Disney cruises, and amusement parks with the greatest forms of entertainment in his Disney World that exists literally all over the world, from Tokyo to France. So he's been amazing. And then in the 1990s, he would conquer Broadway. And when the critics first were aware that Disney bought an old movie theater, the New Amsterdam Theater, and would totally restore it, incidentally, I'm happy to tell you that all of those restoration crews had to come here to see how to do it, which is a great delight. Playhouse Square is the largest restoration theater project in the world, happy to say. I get so tired when they say we're second. I mean, we're first in so many things. Pick those ideas to talk about. Okay, so in any case, when Disney was taking over the New Amsterdam Theater, all of the critics were complaining, saying, oh, we don't want to have a Disneyfied Broadway. Well, of course, what Disney did when he moved in is literally they cleaned up Broadway, and all the drug dealers went away and all the sex trade went away, and suddenly we had this glorious new space. The Great White Way was clearly restored. So Disney conquers all. And again, it's this secret he has of understanding ancient storytelling. Remember that in all of his very sophisticated work that he does, when they made the movie version of Frozen, it took 600 animators, 2 years working 18 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week to complete the project. But he does it with such skill, and he uses all of these ideas of ancient storytelling. So let me remind you, we talked before about the idea of the oral tradition. And we know that one of the great ancient tales is the story of Cinderella. And that was passed on by word of mouth, literally around the world. So we had an Egyptian version, an Asian version, a European version of Cinderella. Keep in mind that in the 17th century, Charles Perrault, who was one of the great French intellectuals, would take all of these great fairy tales that had existed for over 5,000 years, and he would write them down, and suddenly the fairy tale would become a form of literature. And remember, in those beautiful first editions, they were highly illustrated. The greatest artists of the day would illustrate these stories. And so, of course, what we remember most from our childhood is the fact that we're cuddled up in our grandparents' arms and they say, once upon a time, long ago and far away, and it transports us. And Disney understands that, and he still uses that same device, and he still uses that same idea of the power of oral storytelling. Just to remind you, this didn't only happen, of course, with fairy tales. I mean, our great religious books, the Bible, the Koran, all started in an oral tradition. The greatest epic poem of all times and the longest, the Mahabharata, which was written in Sanskrit, existed for thousands of years, being passed on with people memorizing these enormous passages of poetry and passing them on from one generation to the other. So in our literature, much of it starts in that oral tradition. It was Homer who took the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were stories that had been passed on for thousands of years, and the first to write them down. So we understand then the power of storytelling. Important ingredients in storytelling is the use of folklore. What are the habits, the traditions of a country? So as a story would move from one country to another, they would embellish it with the folklore of that country, which would mean the singing, the dancing, whatever the rituals were of that, or cultural ideas were from that particular country. And then, of course, they also would layer it with mythology. And so again, we know that each country has a very strong sense of mythology, and that will all be layered into the story also. We'll see all of that happening in the case of Frozen. Okay, so where we are then is Frozen is based on a beautiful story called The Snow Queen. It was written in the 1900s by Hans Christian Andersen. And as you know, Hans Christian Andersen is one of our greatest storytellers. He was born in 1805, he died in 1875. He would tell stories to children. He kept that tradition. He would make up stories and beguile children with his incredible storytelling. But again, in the tradition of storytelling, you keep learning. Every time you do it, you keep shading it, fixing it, adding elements to it, etc. And so that in The Snow Queen, for example, Hans Christian Andersen would very strongly tap into Norwegian mythology. And so the use of trolls. Trolls are evil characters in the Norwegian mythology. We all have read countless stories about trolls, and they have a whole variety of ranges of being. There are those trolls that are very like humans, and that's what Disney chooses to use in the telling of the story, or they can be very grotesque and very bizarre and very misshapen. But in any case, the whole tradition of it really comes from the idea that in those incredible rocks that surround the fjords in Norway that were carved out by the glaciers, the Norwegians, when they look into those rocks, all see trolls. And if you've ever had the great luxury or pleasure of doing one of those cruises going up to the North Pole, you realize the power of Nordic mythology. Watch for a scene in the second act of the musical. There's a moment when the young Anna, who's the heroine of our story, has had her heart frozen, and she's taken to the hidden people who are really trolls, and trying to be cured. And in the process, they're in a room that's surrounded by these huge rocks. And when you watch the scene, just notice how the trolls sort of come out of the story. It's really beautifully done. It's very subtly done, but it really pulls you into this sort of mythic world that you're going to see. Okay, so Hans Christian Andersen writes The Snow Queen. It is a story about an evil queen, the Snow Queen, who has this incredible power of freezing everything. She can take very verdant valleys and turn them into, covered in ice and totally devoid of any life or nature because she has frozen everything. and it's a very powerful story. I just want to tell you a little story about Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, again, we know so many of his stories. He started them in an oral way, and then friends said, you've got to write them down. Ultimately, he would produce 9 volumes of 156 stories that have been translated into 125 languages. And all of us, of course, remember The Little Match Girl, The Little Mermaid, The Princess and the Pea, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Ugly Duckling. I mean, the list goes on and on. He's absolutely extraordinary. But I want to tell you a little anecdote about him. There was a great soprano in the 19th century named Jenny Lind. And Hans Christian Andersen profoundly admired her. So he wrote a short story called The Nightingale, which he dedicated to Jenny Lind. So from that moment on, she was always known as the Swedish Nightingale. And she was presented in America and literally toured the entire country in the 19th century. P.T. Barnum presented her as the ultimate superstar, and she made more money as a soprano than anyone in the 19th century. So eat your heart out, Madonna. We had lots of brilliant singers long before our present artists. So in any case, Hans Christian Andersen was a very eccentric man, and he, for some reason, fell in love with Jenny Lind. He really didn't know her at all. They met only on a few occasions, but he wrote her a letter of proposal. And I mean, he's the most famous writer in Denmark at the period, and she certainly is not going to insult him. So she was very careful about writing a letter back that says, "Dear brother." And it's very clear that, there is not going to be any acceptance of a proposal. Well, this made Hans Christian Andersen insane, and he was bereft that he had been turned down by Jenny Lind. And so when he published The Snow Queen, he dedicated it to her, saying, "She is the epitome of the evil Snow Queen." So I just want to tell you a funny little comeuppance, though. If Jenny Lind is somewhere in the universe and looking down, she'd be very happy to know that the Snow Queen, treated by Walt Disney, is very different than the way she was treated by Hans Christian Andersen. And she becomes the character Elsa, who is loved by every young girl in the world. So, we can be sure that Jenny Lind would be smiling. And also, it doesn't hurt that Elsa gets to sing the greatest song in the show, Let It Go, which won the Academy Award. So in some ways, up in heaven, Jenny Lind has been redeemed, but leave it to Walt Disney to do it for her. Okay, so in any case, The Snow Queen then is this very powerful story. We fast forward to the 1940s and Walt Disney. Walt Disney, at the time, was very beguiled by Hans Christian Andersen's work. And so he took great pains to get the copyright to all of these works, so it could be the Disney studio that would translate these beautiful stories into animations. You will, of course, remember that many of Disney's work would include those stories, including The Little Mermaid. So in any case, he went to Sam Goldwyn, who was the head of another studio in Los Angeles in the 40s, and said, let's do a movie based on the life of Hans Christian Andersen, and you can cast it, and it should be a musical, and then I will provide the animations. And we'll focus on the Snow Queen. That was the plan. Well, then the Second World War came along, and all those plans were aborted, of course, because Hollywood moved into a mode of doing really propaganda films to keep people's spirits up to get us through that horrific period, the most horrific period in world history at that point. So in any case, after the war, Hollywood being Hollywood, Sam Goldwyn stole the idea and made a movie version of Hans Christian Andersen with Danny Kaye that did not include animation. It would win 6 Academy Awards. So therefore, Walt Disney's idea of working with the Snow Queen would be delayed. Actually, it would take 70 years for the studio to finally create Frozen. Okay, so when this happens, when they're putting together the team to make the movie, the animated version of the Snow Queen, they hire a young woman named Jennifer Lee, who is the book writer for the work, and she will translate the Hans Christian Andersen story into an animated film. And always the rule of thumb at Disney is really the same as it is in any great storyteller. As stories are passed on, you have to make the story yours. So I mean, if the story of Cinderella moved to Europe, then it had to have European references, European mythology, European folklore, etc. And so the same thing is true in the case of Disney. When they're going to approach that, the rule of thumb is to make a great animated film, not to necessarily be true to the original project. So Jennifer Lee, when she studied the work, realized that in the original Snow Queen, the story is very much about the Snow Queen. She will name her Elsa, and then Anna, another powerful young princess. And so in the early meetings, when she's meeting with the animators, and they're just drawing backgrounds, drawing what the castle will look like, drawing what the landscapes will look like, etc. In these early meetings, she says, how can we connect these two women? And somehow in one of these Disney meetings, again, these are storytelling meetings where she would be responsible to tell the story as much as they understood it up to that point. So she starts to tell the story about the Snow Queen, and then we introduce Anna, and she said, how can we connect them? And someone in the group said, why aren't they sisters? And that's, of course, a great idea. And it's an idea that Disney has rarely used. I mean, remember, in all of the princess stories, it's always about the princess and the prince. But remember, we're living in a time right now where women are very conscious of their power and their position that is rightfully theirs. And so, at this point, no woman really wants to be subservient to a prince. And so this story is going to take a very different turn based on the idea that now we're going to deal with a story about two sisters. In the Disney tradition, just so you understand how this works, the studio will hold seminars where anyone who works there who has a sister has to come to a seminar, and they have to talk about what's it like to have a sister. And that's how they gather information. Again, this is an ancient way of passing on information, and something that Disney still uses. Okay, I want to remind you, of course, Walt Disney died in 1966. I keep referring to him in the present tense. I can't help it because his influence is so powerful. So even though he's been gone since 1966, the studio and the whole Disney empire is still controlled by that same philosophy of family and love and rightfulness and doing the right thing and magic, most important of all. So in any case, Jennifer Lee was recently interviewed. I mean, she's one of the most successful screenwriters in the world right now. And who can say I made $1.28 billion the first week of release of a movie? So, she's right at the top of the food chain right now. But when she was interviewed, one of the interviewers said to her, how did you come up with the brilliant idea of having these two characters be sisters? And she said, well, I really didn't. And the interviewer was flabbergasted. And she went on to say it was just someone in the group who said it. And she said, after we moved forward on that, we could never find out who the person was who said it. And keep in mind, they are really responsible for creating the $1.28 billion. So someone's being very modest. All right, in any case, what happens is then Jennifer Lee puts together an extraordinary team to make this movie. She will hire as the music director who will create the music and lyrics for 7.5 songs, Bobby Lopez. You know him as the composer of Avenue Q and Book of Mormon, you then raise your eyebrows and say to me, but those are very sassy works. What's Disney doing with a composer who's written, these works that sometimes are sort of borderline in idea? Remember, when Avenue Q advertised in the New York Times, there was a big line that said, "Warning, there is full frontal puppet nudity in Avenue Q." So this does not sound like Disney to us, but it's the perfect choice because Bobby Lopez and his wife, Kristen Anderson Lopez, who's equally gifted, would collaborate to write an extraordinary score, not only for the movie, but much more importantly for the musical. Okay, so early on, the Lopezes now are living in New York. They have 2 young daughters. Footnote for you, one of the young daughters would sing the role of the princess when they did the recording of the music for the movie, and Jennifer Lee's daughter sang the role of the other princess. So it was very incestuous and very family-oriented when they cast those children's voices in the story. But in any case, the Lopezes are living in New York. They're very much part of the New York musical theater scene. And then, of course, we have this group of 600 animators and then this whole crew of storytellers that are putting together the storyline for Frozen. And every day they talk on the telephone and they have conference calls, and the Lopezes will play some music they're working on, etc. Very early on, the Lopezes had an inspiration for a song for Elsa, who is the Snow Queen. And it would become the great song, Let It Go, which would win the Academy Award. It is one of the most beloved songs ever to win the Academy Award. And it is a show-stopping number in the musical you're going to be seeing. So when they wrote it, they played it. Bobby is playing it on the piano. His wife is singing the role, and everybody on the West Coast is hearing it. And there's dead silence when it's over. And they say, "Don't you like the song?" And they went, "No, it's spectacular, but it means that we have to change everything about Elsa. We realize in this song that Elsa is not an evil queen, which is going to make her even more interesting in the way we tell this story." So the song is really about empowerment. The song, Let It Go, is really about a character, Elsa, coming to terms with who she is. Through the whole first act of the musical, we meet Elsa and Anna as 2 very young children. We learn very early on that Elsa has this extraordinary gift to freeze things. It's a gift that's come from the trolls. There is an early scene where by accident she freezes her sister Anna's brain, and the parents are very bereft, and they have to summon the hidden people who are trolls. And they open the windows, watch for this scene, it's really beautifully done, and they chant, but they're chanting in an ancient sort of musical form that was very much a part of the Sami tribes. So the Sami are ancient tribes that live very close to the North Pole. They're in all of Nordic mythology, and their music, they tell their stories through music, and they pass on their music. They never notate the music, they just pass it on by teaching it to the next generation. And so in this case, you will hear the parents singing, summoning the troll people in this very ancient form of chanting. You see that at the very beginning of the show. Keep in mind, a good opening number in a musical is always about establishing time and place. And so in the opening of this musical, then you hear this, again, this ancient spiritual chanting that really takes you out of our world and into another world, into, in this case, a fantasy world, and it will create the whole atmosphere for the rest of the show. And then also note, when Elsa becomes queen, they also play this Sami chanting. You remember that Walt Disney would use this same device in The Lion King, where he would use ancient African chants in that way. So what I want to remind you of as we go along is that Disney, being the perfect storyteller, always goes back to the mythology of the time, always goes back to the folklore traditions of the time to bring the story to life. Okay, so they write this incredible song. I just want to pause for a moment and remind you that when it's better used in the musical than it was in the movie. It happens at the end of the first act, and it's a perfect diva show-stopping song. Elsa, the actress, now the adult Snow Queen, walks out onto a bare stage, and she starts singing this very powerful song of tremendous introspection. It's right out of a moment in Shakespeare and Hamlet, when Hamlet comes to a sense of awareness about who he is, or it's the same kind of moment in Lear in his madness, when he comes to a sense of awareness of who he is. So one of these great epiphany moments happens in this song, and Elsa realizes that she has spent her whole life hiding away and hiding her gift, when in fact, as the title tells us, she really has to let it go, and she does. And what happens in that number then is she literally freezes the entire stage. You will see absolutely spectacular lighting, projections, special effects. You will see 58,000 crystals hanging in the air, glittering. And then you will see one of the most exciting costume changes you've ever seen in any musical. And even if you go back to see the show 30 times, you're not going to figure out how the costume change works. Poor Elsa, incidentally, every time she's the actress who played it in New York or on the road, whenever they're interviewed, the first question is always, how do you do that costume change? And of course, Walt Disney would cut out her tongue if she told them. So that will remain, like any great magic act, a secret. But in any case, it's such a show-stopping number because visually, from all of the visual effects, from the vocal effects, the song keeps building and building, and there are key changes. And we see, as we listen to the lyrics, listen carefully if you can, because it's so much is going on, but listen carefully to the lyrics, and you realize that this is a pure theater moment when the character comes to a profound sense of awareness about themselves. Okay, so we know that the movie has 7.5 songs, the musical has 23, so a lot of work had to be done. Once the movie opened in 2013, by 2014, they started making the musical. It would take 4 years to do. It was not an easy process. 4 set designers were hired and fired. 2 directors were hired and fired. 2 Elsas were hired and fired. 2 costumers were hired and fired. So this is not a pretty Disney story, I can tell you. But it is a story about the need, this relentless need to find perfection on the stage. And of course, they finally found it. One of the great problems, it's not so much the problem of taking the characters from the movie and transferring them to the stage, but it's the animations that become so difficult. One of the greatest characters in the movie is Olaf, who is a snowman. And of course, what's so funny in the movie is he keeps coming apart and his head rolls down the hill and, his body is separated, and we fall in love with Olaf. And we know that he's really the metaphor of the story. Watch carefully. At the beginning of the show, the 2 young children, as Elsa and Anna, they sing a song called Let's Build a Snowman, which is a charming, delightful song. But listen carefully to the lyrics, because the lyrics say, we'll take a little bit of me and a little bit of you, and we will make Olaf. So Olaf becomes a kind of metaphor about the love these 2 young sisters had for one another. It takes the whole story for us to come back to that by the end of the story. So how do you do Olaf then on the stage? And again, Disney is brilliant in this regard. He uses a device called bunraku puppetry, which means that you see the puppeteer standing behind the puppet. He puts his hand in the head of the puppet and brings it to life. And even going back all those ancient times in the Japanese tradition, your eye stays on the puppet, not on the puppeteer. And it's wonderfully done in this story. And in another way, we have, of course, the wonderful reindeer called Sven that we fall in love with in the movie. And again, on stage, I want you to be aware there's a full body costume and there's a dancer inside of it. And in the front of the costume, he has stilts, and the stilts represent the front legs of the reindeer and then, of course, the big head. And the back legs are done with the dancer being in toe shoes and dancing and moving on his toes. And the image that you get for the body is the perfect reindeer, and it becomes very magical. So all in all, you're in for a phenomenal treat. It's a remarkable story, beautifully told, funny music, delightful music, touching music. And you know, the ancients always said, you have to suspend disbelief when you look at the theater. In other words, you have to, as Disney would say, pretend. So enjoy the magic of Disney. Thank you.